Hi, everybody. Welcome back. I want to continue today with our conversation about the current state of our planet. I know, last week we talked a little bit about, just like, for example, I gave an example of, the Neuse River. That was an example of just one area on our planet that was impacted, by humans. And we used the word anthropogenic last week, for example, to talk about, there's a lot of problems on this planet that are deliberately caused by us. Well, deliberately or non-deliberately caused by us. But again, a lot of these problems can be solved by humans. If people cause them, then people can fix them. We saw the video Man last week, that little cartoon clip. And hopefully, like when you watch that, hopefully there was something in that video that kind of stood out to you as being sort of problematic and maybe something that you're sort of compassionate about as far as maybe not wanting to see that happen anymore on our planet. But again, we'll talk about a lot of those things throughout the year. Today, I want to focus a little bit, at least first of all, or on this first slide, a couple of quick terms and some vocabulary. This is a term here that we haven't talked about yet, but we will talk about throughout the year. It's called an ecosystem service. And to really understand the impact that humans are having on the planet, we have to look at specific things. It says here, ecosystem services, the processes by which the environment provides life-supporting resources. For example, fresh water. Fresh water on this planet is not really an easy thing to find. There's a whole entire unit that we're going to cover all about water. And most of the water on this planet is salt water. So the fresh water that we have, we have to make sure we take care of it. We make sure we don't pollute it and put things into it. But it's a pretty good indicator to us that if the fresh water that we do have is toxic or it's poisoned or it's non-drinkable, that tells us that we're doing something to that resource. There's a lot of ecosystem resources. Fresh water is just one of them. That if we're not careful, we're not. Our planet's not going to be able to provide those things for us. So again, that's a term we will come back to down the road. But initially, I wanted to make sure I exposed you to that. Sustainability. This is something that we talked about, the other day about Easter Island. This is in my opinion, it's the major goal of the human race that we have to protect our planet. We have to make sure that we live in a way that allows us to not over deplete all the resources on our planet, so that our kids will have a place to live and our grandchildren and all that. I mean, I would hate to see, in a couple hundred years, and we have to like go to Mars to live because this planet is no longer, habitable because of the things that we've done to it. But who knows? That could be a reality. But again, we don't want to live like the Easter Islanders lived. We want to make sure that we take care of our planet and make sure that we sustain it for future generations. That's a really important thing. All right, so when we're looking at our planet and trying to, I guess, assess whether or not the planet is healthy, there's a lot of things that we can look at. There's probably 25 or 30, specific things to look at. But in general, there's five really big indicators that can kind of give us a hint of how healthy our planet really is. And I'm going to talk about each one of these just briefly today. Biodiversity, food production, average global surface temperature, and carbon dioxide concentrations. That's basically global warming. Okay, we'll talk briefly about that today. The human population, how many people we have. And finally, resource depletion. How are we using our resources? Those are five things that really can tell us um, fairly easily, how well we're taking care of our planet. So we're going to start with this first one here. It's called biodiversity. And biodiversity basically is a measurement. In Unit 2, which is a few weeks away, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about biodiversity on different scales, different levels. But we can kind of look at, biodiversity on an ecosystem level, kind of a big level. And then we can look at it sort of at a species level, which we'll get into in a second here. And then finally, on a much more microscopic level, the genetic level. But biodiversity, very simple. I mean, here's sort of the definition of it. It says it's the diversity, the different types of life forms in an environment. If we're looking, for example, at biodiversity on a large scale, we can just look at a picture like this. And we can look and see, okay, well, what do we have here, right? We've got like a lake or a pond or something. So there's probably lots of organisms that live there. Probably lots of fish and whatever lives in that pond. You've got like in the background, you have kind of a forested area. So there's probably a lot of organisms that live in the forest that don't live, in the lake. Even behind that, you've got like some mountain areas. There's probably a whole bunch of things that live in those mountains that don't live, in the forest or live in the lake. Even over here in the foreground, there's a kind of a beach, kind of a sandy area over here. There's probably organisms like crabs and things like that that live in that area. So just by looking at this picture, it's probably a pretty good assumption that this is a healthy ecosystem. We have lots of different areas for different things to live, and most likely it would be healthy, unless, of course, the water's poisoned or something. That obviously wouldn't be very healthy. But we have a lot of diversity here. There's different areas where organisms can live. But think about what could lower the biodiversity. Think about if a timber company, came in and knock down all of these trees. So if all of these trees were removed, that would definitely have an impact on diversity. And we're seeing a lot of that. We're seeing areas of our planet where, parts of ecosystems are just being removed or being contaminated to the point where organisms no longer have places to live. So, we want healthy ecosystems. We don't want to jeopardize those things. But when we do that, obviously, it makes the ecosystem much more unhealthy. We can look at diversity on a species level. We can just look at the individual species themselves. You probably remember from biology class your definition of a species, organisms that can interbreed, and that means breed with each other and produce fertile offspring. For example, two zebras can mate and have a baby zebra, right? They're members of the same species. Currently, there's about 2 million species of organisms on Earth. That's a lot, 2 million. That's a lot of. At least that's what's been identified up to this point. There's probably a lot of species that we haven't identified. But if you're talking about, let's say, a forest ecosystem, the number of species that live there, the more there are, the healthier it's going to be. If you have, for example, say two ponds, one pond has 30 different species of fish and another pond only has two species of fish, then obviously one of those ponds is much more biodiverse than the other one is. Okay, so we can just look at species and count them. One of the things that we look at, this picture on the right here, actually, let's look at this picture on the left, I guess, first. This picture on the left is kind of showing us a coral reef. Coral reefs are some of the most um, biodiverse ecosystems on the planet. Probably in this one picture here, there's probably a dozen different species of fish, if not more. I'm going to go back real quick to this previous slide. Oops, a couple of slides ago. Here we again the same thing. We've got a lush coral reef, but what we're seeing is a lot of our coral reefs around the planet are turning into something like this. You'll notice the color is much different. You don't see as many fish swimming around as you do in the picture on the right. This is actually one of the problems with global warming is the temperature of the water is changing, and when the temperature of the water changes just slightly, the coral dies. And when the coral dies, then the fish obviously don't want to live there because they eat some of that stuff, and it just changes the entire thing. So, again, looking at species, counting species, is a good way to tell whether or not an environment is healthy. Another thing we look at least one specific organism, is we look at frogs. Frogs are interesting because they're amphibians, right? So they breathe air, so they require healthy air, and they also require water. Part of their life as a tadpole is they're completely dependent on water. When they become adults, they can live outside, but for a frog to live a healthy life, it must have healthy water and it must have healthy air. So we can go into an environment and we can count frog species. And let's say, I don't know, there's a pond or something, and maybe there's 15 species of frog. And then all of a sudden you come back 10 years later, and instead of there being 15 species of frog, there's only 3 species of frog. So that tells us something, right? It indicates that something has happened in that environment where all those other species of frog are no longer there. So, just counting species is a good way to indicate biodiversity in an area. A couple more things here about species I just want to make sure you're aware of. Extinction. Obviously, when we talk about a species, one thing that kind of comes to mind is extinction. Because species can go extinct. This is called the background extinction rate. The background extinction rate basically tells us what happens just kind of normally. Um, on average, 1 out of 1 million species will go extinct worldwide every year. 1 out of 1 million. And again, that's just like normal. Like, so if we have, for example, 2 million species, we could fully expect 2 of them to go extinct no matter what. I mean, whether or not humans are impacting or they're not, there's going to be 2 species that go extinct every single year. But here's something that's kind of interesting. I mean, we look at that background rate and we think, okay, that's not too bad. I mean, there's 2 million species. We might lose 2 every year. Okay, not that big of a deal. But right now, in reality, what's happening is we're losing about 10,000 species a year. That's average. So worldwide, 10,000 species of organisms. They could be insects, they could be plants, it could be, a lot of the big animals are the ones that kind of get the most publicity. But that's 5,000 times the normal background rate. So that tells us that there's something going on that's not normal. I mean, yeah, some of the biggest causes of these extinctions are things like habitat destruction. Climate change is having a big impact. Invasive species. We're getting species that are moving from one location to another. For example, we're seeing. We'll talk about invasive species a lot this year, but like species of insects that live in, I don't know, Asia, they're making their way to the United States. For how are they getting here? Well, a lot of times these invasive species end up getting from one place to the next just through the transportation industry. They'll be in crates of food, that travel across the Pacific Ocean on a ship, or they'll be in the cargo hold of an airplane. I mean, whatever. I mean, they just get from one point to the next, not because they want to move, but just because people are moving them. So that's kind of a big issue. We'll talk a lot about that as well. Then we look at genetic diversity. Genetics, which we're not going to talk a ton about genetics in this class, but as you talked a lot about this back in your biology days. But genetic diversity is a measure of how much variation there is between individual members of a population. This picture here is a great picture. You got all these penguins, right? And they're all the same species, right? So these penguins can interbreed with each other. They can produce fertile offspring. But that's all because they're the product of sexual reproduction, right? I mean, one penguin has sex with another penguin, they can have a baby penguin. That's how it is, right? But again, during that process, you get the genetics of one bird combining with the genetics of another bird, and they come together to form a completely new organism, right? A new penguin. So, I mean, when you're looking at a population, even though these are all the same type of animal, not every one of them, in fact, every single one of them is different. It's like people, right? I mean, no two people are exactly the same, right? We all have different genes, different hair colors, and eye colors and skin tones and all that type of stuff. It's the same thing with penguins. Even though they all look the same, they are genetically different. But imagine what would happen if every single penguin was was totally the same genetically. I mean, that would be kind of like, two identical twins having a baby together. That doesn't even make sense. Like that couldn't even happen. But that can't happen because their genetics are exactly the same. So it's a good thing that we actually have diversity amongst all these penguins. We don't want them all to be exactly the same. If they did, it'd be sort of like an inbreeding situation. That wouldn't be healthy for the offspring. So, we want genetic diversity amongst the population. The more diversity there is, the better off it's going to be. One thing that we're seeing with species as they become endangered, the more endangered the species is, the less individuals there are. And if there's less individuals, the amount of diversity lessens. And that's not good for the species. So we want to make sure these species can flourish. There's lots of genetic diversity. All right, ecological indicator number 2, food production. We can look at our planet and we can look to see, how are we going to feed everybody here? Right now we've got about 7.5 billion people on our planet. Half of the calories that people consume comes from three things: wheat, corn, and rice. So that includes every one of you. 50% of the average human diet is coming from basically three plants. So if we're going to feed the world, if we're going to feed everybody on our planet, we need to make sure we grow these three plants in mass abundance. And we do. And that's how we can pretty much feed the world. I'm going to take a look here at a graph. And this graph is kind of an interesting one. I'm going to move myself up here. I guess that's the best place I can put myself. Anyway, what this graph is showing us is two different things, but there's a relationship between them. Okay, first of all, over here on this y-axis, okay, this is global grain yield. That's basically how much grain is being produced by the world on all the farms, on every country. This is it now, and it's expressed in a unit called a megaton. A megaton is like this giant unit. It's a huge amount, but whatever. The higher the number, the more megatons, right? So if you look at the bottom here on the x-axis, this is years, right? So back in like 1950, the planet was producing, roughly a half a megaton of grain every single year. Okay, whatever that means. And you'll notice that as we get closer and closer to modern day, that number is going up and up and up and up. And even though this graph goes out to 2050, this is more of a prediction, what that's going to continue to keep doing. So it doesn't really look like we're having any trouble producing grain because we're just making more and more grain every single year. Now that requires more land space, but it is what it is. Now this other line, in fact, this is where this other y-axis comes into play. This is called the per capita yield. Now what that basically means, per capita is per person. So what that tells us is that this is how much grain is available per person. Okay, so whatever, back in 1950, okay, right here, if you kind of go over here, it looks like about 250 kilograms of grain per person per year. Whatever. I guess that's kind of normal, I suppose. And again, the other thing to look at here is just look at this trend, how it's going up and up and up and up. So every single year, there's more and more grain per person, and that's probably a good thing. But you'll notice right here, sort of in the early 1990s, how that number is starting to go down. Even though we're making more grain than we ever have, the per capita amount of grain is going down. That's a little scary, but that's sort of an indication that the number of people on this planet is kind of getting out of control. We can continue to make more grain, but how much of that grain is available per person, that's starting to decrease. And that indicates to us that maybe we're not living very sustainably if we can't feed ourselves. Remember what happened on Easter Island, right? So that's not very good. All right, a couple more things here I want to get to. Number 3, let's move myself again. The third indicator is average global surface temperature and carbon dioxide concentrations. We're going to talk this year a lot about climate change and the temperature of our planet and all these things. But just real quick, greenhouse gases. If you look at this picture here, you see this kind of thin blue line, kind of over the horizon of the Earth, right? That thin blue line is pretty much our atmosphere. That's kind of what protects us, from ultraviolet radiation from the sun, and it traps gases in and kind of keeps our planet healthy. But one of the components of our atmosphere are things called greenhouse gases. Now, greenhouse gases are actually really, really important because these gases actually keep our planet warm. Things like carbon dioxide, that's the big one. Another one, methane, water vapor. These are 3 of the most notorious greenhouse gases. If we didn't have them at all, if those gases were not in the atmosphere, this planet would be a lot colder. It would be like a frozen rock. That's how important these things are. Because these things trap heat, they keep the planet warm. Now, the problem is right now, there's more and more of those gases than there ever have been before. So if you look at this map here, or this graph here, this is a graph taken from the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. And it's just a science lab, and all they're doing is they're just measuring the levels of carbon dioxide in the air. And again, it goes from 1960 all the way up to the 2000s. And one thing you'll notice, just look at the overall trend of the curve, right? There is more and more carbon dioxide gas in the air now than what there was back in 1960. So what does that tell us? If there's more greenhouse gas, then the planet's going to be warmer. Now, there's two major reasons why this is. And again, we'll talk more in depth about them as the year goes on, but one of them is burning fossil fuels. If you have an automobile and you start the engine and it burns gas, you're going to produce carbon dioxide, and that carbon dioxide is going to go up into the air. So that's just one example of burning a fossil fuel, right? Deforestation. Deforestation, we tear down plants, we remove plants, and plants actually are important because they absorb carbon dioxide. If you were to cut it down and burn it, for example, then you would be releasing that carbon dioxide back into the air. So these two things are happening on a massive global scale. And they're the biggest reason why we're seeing this trend. It's a big, big problem. So we need to talk about ways that we can possibly tone that down so we can not have so much CO2 up in the air. Another big indication that there's problems on our Earth is just looking at the total number of people. We have a whole unit that we're going to cover about population size. Just some statistics real quick. Right now, there's about 7.5 billion people on this planet. Every year I talk to my students about this. I've been teaching for 25 years, roughly. And when I first started, this is 25 years ago, 1996, I think it was, there was only about 5.5 billion people. So just in my teaching lifetime, we've added almost 2 billion people to the planet. That is unbelievable to me. They're projecting by 2050 to there be, getting close to almost 10 billion, 9.5 billion people. In 24 hours, 364,000 kids are born, 152,000 people die. It doesn't take a genius to figure out that those numbers are not equal, right? If there's more kids being born than there are people dying, the population's going to go up. So, I mean, right now, our population, in this on the planet is going up. Now, we can kind of look at it country by country, and there's some major differences there. But as a planet, this is kind of what the statistics are showing us. And finally, resource depletion. This is the last indicator to us, that kind of tells us that there's something wrong. If we're running out of resources, then that probably means we're not using things in a very sustainable way. I know with Easter Island, we talked a little bit about this. Make sure you do kind of understand a little bit in general that there's two different types of resources, right? We've got the non-renewable type, or we call that finite. These are things that we'll run out of if we're not careful. Things like oil, coal, uranium. We use that to generate nuclear energy, for example. Those are things that we will run out of eventually if we don't use them sustainably, period. There are some non-renewable resources that we can recycle. Aluminum, for example. All the aluminum that's on the planet right now, that's it. That's all the aluminum we have. So if we're going to, make cans out of aluminum, if we can recycle that, then we can keep reusing it. So that would be a good thing. You can't like recycle uranium, or coal. It's kind of, not really something we have the resources to do. Some resources are renewable or they're infinite. That means we're not really worried about running out of them. Wood, I mean, as long as you replant trees, you're not going to run out. Now, Easter Island, they didn't replant their trees, so they ran out. Wind, water, we're not going to run out of those things. But if we don't take care of our water, then we're not going to have any or have anything to drink. So that's kind of an issue. All right, guys, those are the 5 indicators. Make sure you look over these notes. Have a good day. Bye.